Clark, who you see also there on the right. All right, let's discuss all of this with my panel now. Former federal prosecutor Joe Moreno, Richard Painter, law professor at the University of Minnesota and the chief White House ethics lawyer in the George W. Bush administration, and the former communications director of the Republican National Committee, Doug Heye. Gentlemen, it's great to see all of you. And Joe, I want to start with you because what we saw in this Georgia indictment is Fani Willis saying that the former president was at the helm of a criminal syndicate, essentially. She said this indictment tells the whole story. Do you think it's a convincing indictment?
Well, it's an ambitious set of charges, right? I mean, they could have gone with a conspiracy type charge, and instead they used a racketeering statute, which, by my understanding, in Georgia is even more broad than what we had up at the federal level. And the fact that they're charging 19 people, including several attorneys, that's aggressive. I mean, many prosecutors try to avoid charging lawyers because we typically get that protection that we're giving legal advice. Here, the position is basically that those lawyers were part of the criminal conspiracy. So I would say this is a very, very aggressive prosecution's set of charges. And as your correspondent pointed out, this is not something that the current or future president can stop in its tracks. I mean, this will continue on regardless of what happens to candidate or possibly even future President Trump.
Doug, coming to you, how significant do you think it is that members of the very inner circle of the former president's team have also been indicted?
It's obviously very significant, and it tells us that the trial, where all eyes are going to be on Donald Trump, we may want to have some eyes on some of these other potential witnesses as well. What do they testify about what Donald Trump did, what he did, when did he know it, and so forth, and also what revelations they may have as to whether they're testifying or potentially copping a plea deal. Somebody like a Mark Meadows especially, who was intimately involved with every activity that the president was making, will be somebody who potentially could flip on Donald Trump, whether on the stand or in his own way of cutting a plea deal. Makes those witnesses much more interesting, those defendants much more interesting than they otherwise would be. All eyes are going to be on Donald Trump. They always are. This makes it even more interesting as to these other cast of characters.
Joe, is that the reason then that we would see the prosecutors indict 19 people here so that they might possibly defect and offer information on the former president?
Well, sure, you have 19 people with 19 different legal strategies, right? I mean, some might lawyer up and just fight. Others might flip. Others might take some convincing and maybe not flip soon, but may take a while, but eventually cooperate. Remember, this is different than in the federal case where there are a number of unindicted co-conspirators. This is a step further, right? This is going into 19 different people. And I know that everyone's talking about a speedy trial, but keep in mind that the fact that not only is this Georgia case fourth in line, but the fact that there's 19 defendants means it's going to take that much longer for this to get a trial set up. So it's aggressive, but it doesn't mean it's going to be quick.
All right, that's a good point, and that brings up the timeline of what we're going to be seeing next year. I just want to take a look at that with you all right now because it's a very busy legal schedule. So Trump will appear in court in October when the New York Attorney General's civil fraud trial against him begins. Then on January 15th, Trump's second defamation trial brought by writer E. Jean Carroll is set to open. Later that month, Trump, his company, and 3 of his children will face a trial accusing them of luring people to invest in sham business opportunities. In March, New York's criminal case against Trump for falsifying business records as part of hush money payments to Stormy Daniels will begin. Finally, 2 months later, Trump's federal classified documents trial is set to start, just some 169 days out from Election Day in the U.S. So already a busy schedule, and that is before you add in the dates for the January 6th documents trial or these latest charges in Georgia. So central strategy that it appears we're going to see from the president, former president's team, is the First Amendment defense, that this is part of his right to free speech. We could see that with the co-defendants here as well. How convincing is that argument in this case?
You know, so much with Donald Trump really depends on the audience. If you're a Trump supporter, that's one of the first places that they go to defend him. You're limiting what a presidential candidate can and can't say, and that will be unprecedented. If you're a Trump skeptic, obviously you're going to think very differently on this. And Trump, as we've seen him do so often, is beholden to his base and also hopes to activate his base. He doesn't really go after moderate or independent voters. And this whole process, while yes, very legally oriented for Trump. He very, very serious jail time could potentially happen for Trump, is also happening in a very political context. And he's trying to maximize the politics of this to benefit him more than anyone else. And I would caution those who are indicted with Donald Trump on this. Loyalty is a one-way street with Donald Trump. And so often we see people trying to score points with Donald Trump, but he doesn't give points. He only takes them away one at a time, and that certainly could happen in this trial, too. Anybody who's indicted with Donald Trump could be thrown under the bus at any moment in anything that could benefit him politically and certainly legally.
Yeah, that makes it certainly very difficult to line up all these co-defendants' cases, as you're saying there, Doug. Joe, I want to come back to you just again to get my head around this question of timing. So in the very near future, we're going to see, we know that the Fani Willis wants to see all of the co-defendants arraigned, surrendered by the end of next week. So how does the arraignment process work when you have this many co-defendants?
I mean, we've seen it happen on one-off cases so far with Donald Trump in the last few months. With that many people, you'll have quite a spectacle, right? So I don't know if cameras will be on at an arraignment. I've heard different things about Georgia courts, but you'll see a lot of people at least walking up to the courthouse, and so it'll be a full few days of 19 people showing up to be arraigned. And then keep in mind, it's pretty quick. So for people who expect a big spectacle, it won't be a whole lot that we'll see. It's really very procedural, and then we're going to have a big lag as these 19 different defendants have to figure out how they plan to defend themselves against these charges.
The Republicans in Georgia right now, and Doug, coming to you, because it is really interesting to see the Governor Brian Kemp and the Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger. They have both hit back at the former president. And I think we have a tweet from the governor, Brian Kemp, saying the 2020 election in Georgia was not stolen for nearly 3 years now. Anyone with evidence of fraud has failed to come forward under oath and prove anything in a court of law. Our elections in Georgia are secure, accessible, and fair, and will continue to be as long as I'm governor. The future of our country is at stake in 2024, and that must be our focus. So, Doug, until now, it seems to be the equation that anybody who goes against the former president suffers, particularly in the polls, but that hasn't been the case here in Georgia. So how do you explain this?
Yeah, well, one, Brian Kemp's very popular with Republican voters in the state, has been for a long time, is seen as a very conservative Republican governor in a otherwise very conservative state. But also what he's saying here is pretty clear, as is the Secretary of State. By defying Trump here, if they didn't defy Trump, they'd have to basically say Donald Trump is right. In other words, we can't administer our own elections, which would be untenable. If they were to say that Donald Trump was right, they'd be saying that they're incompetent, which they're not, because there wasn't this massive fraud. And ultimately, Republicans in Georgia are paying the price for Donald Trump's rhetoric here, because 3 times now, twice in the runoffs, and then most recently with Herschel Walker, what we've seen is Donald Trump's rhetoric have held Republicans back in Georgia and have sunk 3 different Republican Senate campaigns moving forward for 2024. If you're Brian Kemp, you don't want that to happen again, and that's why you're holding the line that you are. It's advantageous for them in a sort of paradoxical way because, as you said, other Republicans have been penalized. But to go along with Donald Trump's line here would be admitting your own incompetence where it doesn't exist.
Yeah, Georgia is such a fascinating state politically, isn't it? Joe, I want to come back to you. If you are looking ahead to the possibility of a trial, what will you be looking for in terms of what the prosecutors might present in terms of evidence and witness testimony and so on?
Which one, I guess, right? I mean, if we're working backward and it's the Georgia trial, I'm fascinated by the evidence of what the attorney co-defendants said and were involved with. I mean, again, as was pointed out, we lawyers aren't typically held accountable, and it probably is good if, in fact, they were part of this conspiracy. So I'll be fascinated to hear about the evidence regarding Rudy Giuliani or the other attorneys that were charged here. As an attorney myself, I'm fascinated to see them actually being held accountable.
Just quickly, we do have a Republican candidate debate next week. Does Donald Trump show up for that as he's now facing 4 indictments?
I think most likely not, and politically that would be the smart thing to do. You don't want to give your opponents the oxygen to attack you, and if he's there, it'll be more eyeballs and more of an opportunity for those people running against him who've thus far been very hesitant to criticize Trump to maybe take him on directly.
Yeah, well, we'll wait to see what decision he reaches there, but he has said until now that he's not sure, and he's not sure it serves him politically. So perhaps, Doug, that is the point that we will come to next week to find out if he decides otherwise, if his team decides otherwise. But to all of you, Joe, Richard, and Doug, thank you very much for your insights. Really great to talk to you tonight. And thank you for watching The Context. We'll be back in just a few moments with some more news. Stay with us.